The wind cut across the lonely estate like a sharpened blade, rattling the windows of the grand yet cold mansion perched atop the hillside. Inside, the heavy doors groaned as the carriage rolled to a halt. A hush fell over the staff. They had heard rumors, but nothing could prepare them for the sight that stepped from the carriage. A girl, no older than 12 or 13, staggered down the steps, her small frame hunched under the weight of iron chains that clinked softly with every tentative step. Her hair, once golden, was matted with dirt and sweat, and her clothes were tattered rags that hung loosely, exposing the bruises along her arms and legs. Her eyes, large, wary, and filled with both fear and pain, darted around the courtyard, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The man who watched from the doorway, tall and imposing, felt a twinge of something long buried, an uneasy mixture of curiosity and instinctive protectiveness. He had lived a life of wealth and isolation, constructing walls between himself and the tragedies of the world. Yet, as he took in the girl's fragile form, those walls trembled. She was a creature of vulnerability, a silent scream in human form, and for reasons he could not articulate, she demanded his attention. The carriage driver stepped forward, holding out a folded note from whoever had sent her. The man took it reluctantly, reading words that were sparse, almost clinical, yet carried a weight heavier than any sum of money. Found in the ruins, needs care. Dangerous if left unattended. He looked back at the girl, noting the dull sheen of dirt on her skin, the way she hugged herself instinctively, and the faint, ragged breath escaping her lips. The child's arrival created a stir among the household staff. Whispered guesses filled the air. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is she alive? The girl seemed aware of their scrutiny, lowering her head as if shrinking into herself to disappear. One of the younger servants, a girl no older than she, dared to step closer, offering a tentative hand. The girl flinched, recoiling as though the touch carried sparks of pain. It was clear she had known little kindness in her life. The man observed all this with a critical eye, noting not only her physical condition, but the subtle signs of trauma in her posture, the twitch of her hands, the avoidance of eye contact. He recognized something familiar in her fear, not his own, but a reflection of the world's cruelty he had witnessed from a distance. The chains were more than metal. They were a statement of ownership, captivity, and suffering. And yet, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, a fragile defiance that refused to break completely. For a long moment, silence reigned. The girl's gaze wandered, lingering on the mansion's windows, the stone steps, the distant hills. Perhaps she saw freedom in them. Perhaps she merely imagined it. Then, slowly, carefully, the man stepped forward, his voice low, calm, and firm. "Come inside." Her eyes flickered up, meeting his for the briefest instant. There was no trust there, yet only recognition. Recognition that she had been seen. That someone acknowledged her existence. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was enough to start the delicate, dangerous journey from fear toward hope. As the servants helped her into the warmth of the grand hall, the man lingered in the doorway, staring at the chains that still bound her wrists. He wondered if he could ever free her, not just from iron, but from the past that clung to her like a shadow. The house was quiet now, yet it felt heavier, burdened by the presence of this child who carried a world of suffering in her small, trembling body. And in that moment, he felt the first hesitant stirrings of a purpose he had long forgotten: to protect, to nurture, to give a second chance to a life teetering on the edge of oblivion. The girl's arrival had left a ripple through the quiet halls of the mansion, and in the days that followed, her presence became a silent, pressing weight on everyone who lived there. She moved cautiously, almost ghost-like, avoiding the polished floors and the curious eyes of the staff. Meals were offered and left untouched. Soft-spoken instructions went unheeded. She was wary, untrusting, as if the world had taught her that kindness was always followed by pain. It was in this tense, fragile atmosphere that the man's young child, his daughter, bright-eyed and innocent, entered the scene in a way no one expected. Unlike the adults, she did not notice the chains or the bruises in the same way. She only saw a small girl who looked tired, scared, and painfully lonely. She approached slowly, dragging her doll behind her, and peered up at the newcomer with unfiltered curiosity. "Daddy?" she said softly, tugging at the man's sleeve. He was standing nearby, observing the girl in chains as she sat huddled in a corner of the grand hall. Is she dying?" The words hit him like a cold wind. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing, heart tightening. It was not the question itself that startled him, but the innocence in which it was asked, the raw honesty that dared to speak what the adults were too cautious to even think. The girl in chains flinched at the sound of the child's voice, curling even tighter around herself as though expecting a punishment that never came. He knelt to the child's level, steadying her small shoulders with his hands. "No," he said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "She's not dying, but she is very hurt, and she needs help." The child tilted her head, considering this. Her small brow furrowed, lips pressing together as she studied the girl's sunken eyes and pale face. She looked so small, so scared. Can we help her?" The man's chest tightened again. Her words were simple, almost too simple, yet they carried a weight he had not anticipated. The question, so human, so blunt, forced him to confront the truth he had been skirting. This girl, this broken, frightened child, could not save herself. She had no one, no name, no home. And if he did not act, she might never have a chance. He guided his daughter back to the edge of the room, giving her a gentle hand on the shoulder. "We can help," he said, "but it will take time. And it will not be easy. She may not trust us at first." The girl in chains remained still, her eyes fixed on the floor, listening. It was the first time she had heard anyone speak of her as if her life mattered, as if she could have a future beyond the chains and the fear. Something fragile stirred inside her, a tiny spark, almost imperceptible, but it was there. That evening, the man stayed longer than usual in the room with her. He brought water and a small blanket, speaking softly, not demanding, not instructing, just speaking. The girl did not respond at first, her body tense, shoulders rigid. Yet he continued, patiently, letting her presence absorb the safety he offered. He realized that trust was not something to be given. It was something earned, slowly, like coaxing sunlight through thick clouds. Later, as he left the room, he heard his daughter whisper to herself, still peeking around the doorway, "She's not dying, Daddy. But maybe we can make her live again." The words stayed with him long after the child had gone to bed. They were innocent, but they carried a truth that he could not ignore. The girl in chains was not just an object of pity, she was a life suspended, a soul waiting to be saved. And the question, so simple yet profound, had awakened in him a sense of responsibility he had buried for too long, to see her not as broken, but as someone who could be made whole. That night, as the fire flickered in the great hall and shadows danced along the walls, he resolved that this girl so small, so fragile, would not be left to her fate. She would have a chance, a name, and a life beyond her chains. And perhaps in saving her, he would also save something within himself that he had thought lost forever. The man could not shake the image of the girl in chains. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint bruise on her wrist, the haunted look in her eyes, and the way she flinched at the slightest movement. That night, sleep eluded him. The house was quiet, but his mind raced, filled with questions he did not yet know how to answer. Where had she come from? Why had she been left in such a state? And most pressing of all, who had the right to claim her, and who had harmed her? By morning, he had resolved to find out. He summoned the carriage driver, an older man with a weathered face and years of service at the estate. "Tell me everything you know," he demanded, voice steady but edged with urgency. The driver hesitated, shuffling his feet, glancing at the girl sitting quietly in the corner of the hall, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls. "Sir, I was only following orders," he said. "I don't know much, only that she was found at the ruins outside the Eastern Valley, wrapped in rags and chains. I was told to bring her here and leave her in your care." The man frowned, feeling the tension tighten around his chest. "The ruins? Who sent her?" he asked, trying to push for specifics. But the driver shook his head, muttering that it was a messenger of some sort, someone who refused to be named. The message had been brief: deliver her safely and make no questions. Unsatisfied, the man turned to the household records and local reports. The girl's arrival had caused murmurs in the village below the estate, but no one knew her name, no one claimed to know her. Even the guards who patrolled the outskirts had only seen a small figure wandering near the ruins, alone and frightened. There were whispers of bandits, of an abandoned orphanage, of cruel masters who traded in children, but nothing concrete. He realized that piecing together her past would require more than facts. It would require intuition, careful observation, and patience. He began to watch her closely, noting every hesitation, every flinch, every small expression that might hint at her previous life. She avoided certain rooms, recoiled at sharp voices, and reacted to certain scents, the smell of leather or firewood, with visible terror. These tiny clues became pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. He also began to speak to her, softly, without pressure. "Did someone hurt you?" he asked one afternoon, kneeling beside her as she sat on a worn chair by the window. She froze, eyes wide, lips pressed tightly together. Not a word came, but a shiver ran through her small frame. He understood that her silence was as much protection as it was fear. She had learned long ago that speaking could lead to pain. Determined, he enlisted the help of a trusted housekeeper who had grown up in the area and knew many of the local families and histories. Together they followed leads: a deserted cabin near the ruins, old records of missing children, and whispers from the traveling merchants who occasionally passed through. Every lead was cold, but each offered a faint glimmer, a scrap of paper, a half-remembered tale, a mark on a doorframe. Through it all, the girl began to observe him differently. She noticed his persistence, the way he did not force her to answer, the way he kept returning even when she remained silent. Perhaps for the first time, she realized that someone cared enough to seek the truth, not just impose it. And in that realization, a fragile trust began to form, though her lips still remained sealed, and the chains, both visible and invisible, still clung tightly to her. By the end of the week, the man had gathered enough small details to sketch a faint outline of her past life of captivity, a journey through suffering, and the shadow of people who had used her for their own ends. He did not yet know names or motives, but one thing became clear: the girl's history, though hidden, could not dictate her future. And he, in his lonely, burdened way, would ensure that the chains of her past were not the chains of her tomorrow. The first morning he decided to care for her properly, the man felt a strange tension in his chest. It was not just responsibility, it was the weight of confronting someone else's suffering, of crossing a line he had long avoided. He had been a solitary man for years, content with the cold precision of wealth and the predictable quiet of his estate. Yet the sight of the girl, fragile and trembling, demanded action that no ledger or protocol could contain. He entered her room quietly, closing the door behind him so that no one could intrude. The girl was huddled on the edge of the small cot, knees drawn to her chest, chains still glinting faintly in the morning light. Her hair clung to her face in grimy tangles, her clothes were threadbare, and dark rings framed her eyes. She did not look at him, did not move. She merely waited as though expecting the worst. He began with the simplest act: warmth. He stoked the fireplace until the cold stones radiated gentle heat, and the room, once frigid and oppressive, seemed alive with a quiet comfort. Then he placed a small bowl of warm broth by her side. "You must eat," he said softly. There was no command in his voice, only insistence tempered with patience. She flinched at the sound but did not move away. When she did not touch the food, he knelt beside her, offering a spoon. She recoiled at first, then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, allowed the broth to brush her lips. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his briefly, then darted away again. That tiny acknowledgment, a fleeting moment of trust, felt monumental to him. Next came the bath. He had instructed a maid to prepare warm water and a soft cloth, but he insisted on helping her undress, aware that every gentle gesture had to communicate safety, not command. She resisted, stiffening at each touch, but he spoke quietly, narrating each step with calm clarity. "This will make you clean and warm. No one will hurt you here." The water soothed her muscles, and though she initially trembled with fear, she gradually relaxed under the warmth and care. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she felt a fleeting sense of security. As he gently washed the grime from her hair, he noticed the faintest curl returning to the ends of her hair, the way her shoulders lost some of their tension. Clothing came next, a simple dress, plain yet clean, that symbolized more than modesty. It was a shield against the harshness of her past and the first step toward reclaiming her identity. When she finally looked at her reflection, she caught a glimpse of herself not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a girl small, fragile, yet undeniably alive. She whispered nothing, but her fingers clenched the fabric of the dress in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of wonder and tentative pride. Throughout the day, he stayed nearby, reading softly to her, explaining the rooms, pointing out the gardens she had yet to explore. He did not rush her. He did not demand words, laughter, or even acknowledgement. Each small act of care, the warm meal, the bath, the clean dress, was a thread woven into the fragile tapestry of trust he was attempting to create. By evening, she sat quietly in a corner, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fire with wide, cautious eyes. She had not spoken, but she had allowed herself to be seen, touched, and nurtured without resistance. And for the man, that quiet acceptance, fragile as it was, marked the first real victory. He understood that care alone would not erase the trauma she had endured, but it was a beginning, one small, vital step toward healing. That night, as he closed her door, he felt an unfamiliar warmth stir in his chest. It was hope, not just for her, but for both of them. For the first time in years, the mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a home. And in the quiet, he resolved silently that he would not stop here. He would continue patiently, tenderly, and unwaveringly until she could walk out of those chains, both visible and invisible, and begin to live. Days passed since the first act of care, and the girl began to settle into a fragile routine. She still flinched at sudden movements, still avoided direct eye contact, but she no longer shrank completely into herself. The man watched her closely, noting every small gesture, every hesitant glance. He understood that true transformation would take time, but he was determined to give her something tangible, something that could help her see herself beyond the shadow of chains and neglect. He summoned a seamstress, one he trusted completely, and instructed her to craft a simple dress, not ornate, not ostentatious, but something clean, soft, and fitting for a girl of her age. It must be something that will make her feel safe, but also herself, he told the woman. The seamstress nodded, carefully taking measurements while the girl, at first reluctant, allowed her hands to be guided. There was a tension in the air, a silent question lingering between them. Would this dress change anything, or would it simply be another reminder of the world's indifference? The dress arrived a few days later, a modest, pale garment with subtle embroidery at the hem. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent meant to soothe. The man held it out to the girl gently. "This is for you," he said softly. "It's yours." You may wear it whenever you wish." She froze, her eyes widening at the sight of it. Her small hands hovered over the fabric, uncertain, almost fearful of ownership, as though receiving something so pure and unspoiled was foreign to her. He knelt beside her. "No one is forcing you," he whispered. "You can choose to wear it or not. But I want you to have something that is only yours. Something that belongs to you, not to anyone else." The girl hesitated, trembling. Then, slowly, she reached for the dress, feeling the smooth fabric between her fingers. The softness contrasted sharply with the rough rags she had worn for so long. For a moment, she closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent, letting herself imagine what it would be like to feel normal, to feel seen. When she finally put the dress on, a transformation began not just in appearance, but in spirit. The simple garment seemed to wrap around her like a protective shield. She looked at her reflection in a polished mirror, barely recognizable to herself. The chains that had clung to her wrists and body had not vanished, but somehow, for the first time, she felt less defined by them. She was more than her suffering, more than the fear that had followed her like a shadow. The man watched quietly, standing in the doorway, careful not to intrude. He saw the faintest hint of a smile tug at the corners of her lips, the tiniest spark of pride in her eyes. He understood then that a dress, something as simple as fabric stitched together, could carry enormous power. It was not magic, but it was a symbol, a signal to the girl that she could belong somewhere, that she could be seen, and that she could reclaim herself from the ruins of her past. She twirled once, clumsily at first, then with a growing sense of joy. The sound of her laughter, quiet and hesitant, filled the room. It was the first genuine laughter he had heard from her, unguarded and real. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of relief and awe. In that moment, the dress became more than a garment. It became the first step in her transformation, a bridge between the frightened child she had been and the girl she could become. By the evening, the girl sat by the fire, the folds of the dress catching the light, and for the first time she seemed comfortable in her own skin. She no longer flinched at touch, no longer shrank at presence. The dress had done something remarkable. It had given her a glimpse of dignity, identity, and hope. And the man, watching from across the room, realized that this small act he had thought minor might very well be the turning point in her journey toward a second life. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the girl's room, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. She sat quietly, her new dress slightly wrinkled from sleep, her eyes tracing the shadows of the furniture as though mapping every corner of the room. The chains were gone from her wrists now, replaced by the soft warmth of freedom, but the invisible chains, the ones wrought from fear, mistrust, and the weight of her past, remained. The man entered, carrying a small tray with bread, cheese, and a cup of warm milk. He set it gently on the table beside her, careful not to startle her. She looked up briefly, then returned her gaze to the floor. In the silence that followed, he felt the gravity of what needed to be done. Giving her food, a bath, and a dress had begun to free her body, but her spirit remained tethered to shadows of her unknown past. She had never had a name, not a real one, not one she could call her own. Names carry identity, power, and hope, and he knew it was time she had hers. He knelt before her, folding his hands over his knees. "I want to give you something today," he said softly, measuring each word. "Something very important. You've lived so long without it, and I believe it's time." She tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. She had learned to listen carefully, but never to expect kindness in its purest form. "You've never had a name," he continued. "You've been called things that weren't yours, but a name. A name is a part of you, something no one can take away, something that belongs only to you." He paused, letting the words sink in. The girl's hands clutched the folds of her dress. She did not speak, and yet her eyes held a question. Could this be true? Could she actually own something, even just a name? He reached into his pocket and drew out a small piece of parchment, ink already drying in careful letters. "I've thought carefully," he said, "and I believe this suits you. From this moment you will be called Alara." The name rolled off his tongue with a quiet reverence, as if speaking it aloud breathed life into the very air. Alara blinked, the word unfamiliar yet strangely soothing. She repeated it quietly to herself, testing its sound against her lips, as though discovering a new part of her own reflection. Era, she whispered, her voice fragile but growing steadier. It was the first time she had ever spoken a word that truly belonged to her, and the air between them seemed to shift. Something unspoken loosened a tether to the shadow she had carried for so long. The man smiled, a rare and gentle expression that lit his face. "Yes, that's you, Alara," he said. "No one else. Only you." She looked up at him, and for the first time, a flicker of trust and maybe even hope passed through her gaze. She allowed herself a small, uncertain smile, one that lacked hesitation or fear. He reached out and touched her shoulder lightly, not as a master or a guardian, but as someone offering support, an anchor in a world that had never treated her gently. "From now on," he said, "Alara, you have a place here. You have people who care for you. You have a life to live and a story that is yours to tell." The act of giving a name was more than a word. It was a rebirth. It was the first step in transforming her from a girl defined by chains and fear into someone who could imagine a future, someone who could breathe without flinching at every sound. Alara repeated her name several times, each utterance slowly gaining strength, until the room seemed to vibrate with its presence. That evening, as she sat by the fire, the folds of her dress catching the flickering light, she whispered, "I am Alara." And for the first time the word felt like a shield, a banner, and a promise all at once. And the man, watching her from across the room, understood that giving her a name had not just given her an identity, it had given her a second life. The days after Alara received her name were quiet, but in that quiet, a subtle transformation began. The girl who had once flinched at shadows and recoiled from hands was slowly learning that she could exist in this house without fear. Her steps grew steadier, her eyes less wary, and a tentative curiosity began to replace the instinctive dread that had governed her every move. The man observed her closely, recognizing the fragile progress she had made. He knew that care and a name could only go so far. Trust, affection, and the sense of being valued had to be nurtured with patience. He began to spend longer stretches of time with her, not demanding conversation, not offering lectures, simply being present. He would sit beside her while she traced the patterns of the carpet with her fingers, read aloud from old books, or point out details in the garden visible from the window. Alara, at first, remained silent. Words were still dangerous, too closely associated with punishment or disappointment. But she began to respond with subtle gestures, watching him from across the room, leaning slightly toward his voice, even allowing herself a quiet laugh when his story's humor caught her off guard. The sound startled him at first, soft and tentative, but it carried a power he had not anticipated, the proof that she was alive, that she could feel joy again. One afternoon, he brought her into the garden. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Sunlight danced across the leaves, and the small stone paths glimmered with dew. He held a small bird in his hands, rescued from a broken wing the day before. "Look," he said softly, placing it gently in her hands. "It's safe now. It will heal." Alara's fingers closed cautiously around the bird, and for a moment she froze, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Then, slowly, the tension melted from her hands, and she cradled it with care, whispering a tiny word of encouragement. The bird chirped, almost as if responding to her voice, and a smile shy and uncertain broke across her face. From that moment, their bond began to deepen. He taught her to care for small things, plants, animals, the tiniest details of life that demanded patience and gentle attention. In return, she taught him something he had long forgotten: the joy of witnessing growth, the exhilaration of earning trust, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a fragile life begin to flourish. They became companions in the simplest, most profound sense, sharing the silent language of glances, gestures, and unspoken understanding. Evenings were spent by the fireplace, reading together or simply sitting in quiet companionship. The man began to notice how she watched him, how she anticipated his actions, how her laughter and sighs began to fill the space in ways that no wealth or luxury had ever done. For Alara, the man became more than a protector. He became a safe presence, a figure she could look to without fear, someone who could anchor her to the world. Yet it was not a perfect bond. She would sometimes retreat, flinching at sudden movements or harsh tones. The man understood that trust could not be forced, it had to be earned again and again. And so he remained patient, unwavering, present even when she closed herself off. Every small sign of connection, a shared smile, a careful touch, a word spoken without fear was celebrated in silence, a victory in the slow reclaiming of her life. By the end of the week, the house felt warmer, lighter, and more alive. Where once silence had reigned, there was now a fragile melody of companionship. Elura's eyes, once haunted and wary, held glimmers of curiosity, of mischief, and of hope. And the man, watching her from across the room, realized that in forming this bond, they were saving each other. He was restoring her to life, and she was restoring him to humanity. In that quiet, unassuming way, a paternal connection took root, an invisible, unspoken tether of trust, care, and affection, strong enough to guide them both through the shadows yet to come. The fragile sense of safety that had begun to bloom around Alara was suddenly threatened, though the first signs were subtle. A whisper carried by the wind, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of the garden, the faint echo of unfamiliar boots on the gravel. The man noticed immediately, instinctively scanning the horizon, his body tensing in ways long forgotten. He had built walls around his life, around his estate, but now the walls were not enough. There were forces beyond them, reminders that the past could reach across distance and time. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the grand hall, the housekeeper approached him quietly, her face pale. "Sir, I've heard things." Travelers spoke of a girl matching her description, wandering near the eastern ruins. "People are talking, and some are looking for her." Her voice trembled as she spoke the words, careful not to startle Alara, who sat nearby sewing a small cloth doll under the dim lamplight. The man's jaw tightened. He had feared this moment, the possibility that someone from her past or those who had harmed her might come for her. He glanced at Alara, who looked up, sensing the tension but not yet understanding it. "We must be cautious," he said, his voice steady but low, concealing the urgency within. "For now, we stay vigilant. No one leaves the grounds alone, and we trust no one blindly." The next days were a study in tension. He reinforced the estate's defenses, instructing the guards to patrol more frequently and to report any unusual activity immediately. Visitors were turned away politely but firmly. He began teaching Alara subtle precautions, explaining in gentle, age-appropriate terms how to remain safe, how to listen, observe, and retreat if necessary. Though young, she absorbed the lessons quickly, her sharp eyes and instinctive caution proving invaluable. One afternoon, a figure appeared at the edge of the property, a silhouette moving with intent near the gardens. The man and the guards observed silently from the windows, hearts pounding. The intruder did not approach carelessly. There was purpose in their steps, a familiarity that set alarm bells ringing. The man realized that her past was not just a memory, it was a threat, alive and determined, willing to reach across distance to reclaim or punish. He acted swiftly, summoning Alara to his side and leading her to a hidden room he had prepared for emergencies. "Stay here," he instructed, kneeling beside her and taking her small hands in his. "You are safe. No one will touch you. Not while I am here." The words were firm, and the warmth of his hands reinforced their promise. Though scared, she nodded, trusting him without hesitation, her faith in his protection solidified through the weeks of care and attention. When the intruder attempted to breach the estate, the man confronted them directly. His voice was cold, commanding, leaving no room for negotiation. "Leave now," he said. "She is under my protection. If you value your life, you will walk away." The figure hesitated, and in that pause, the man's resolve and his readiness to defend Alara with everything he had was unmistakable. Threats were measured against the certainty in his eyes. He would not allow harm to touch her again. After the intruder retreated, the man returned to Alara, who had watched silently from the safety of her hidden room. He held her close, speaking softly. "You are safe now. No one will take you from here, not ever." She clung to him, trembling, the residual fear lingering, but in his presence it began to ease. That night, as the wind howled outside and the estate settled back into uneasy quiet, the man realized that protection was more than physical safety. It was trust, vigilance, and unwavering commitment. And for Alara, it was a lesson in resilience. Though danger might exist, she was no longer powerless. Together, they had confronted the shadow of her past and emerged intact, their bond stronger, their determination to reclaim her life unshakable. From that day forward, the estate became more than a sanctuary, it was a fortress of hope, a place where care, vigilance, and love intertwined to shield a fragile life from the lingering shadows of cruelty. The days following the confrontation were quieter, but they carried a new energy, one born from relief, trust, and the slow unraveling of fear. The shadow of her past still lingered in the corners of Alara's mind, but it no longer dictated her every movement. Freed from the immediate threat, she began to explore the estate with a cautious curiosity that had never before been possible. Each day, she grew a little stronger, a little braver, a little more alive. The man watched her with a mixture of awe and quiet pride. He had known her only a short time, yet he had witnessed a transformation that few could understand. Where she had once flinched at voices, shadows, or the faintest touch, she now moved with purpose, slowly testing the boundaries of her new life. The sunlight on the terrace revealed her hair catching golden streaks, and the small smile she offered when a bird landed nearby felt like a miracle in motion. He continued the rituals of care meals prepared carefully, warm baths in the evenings, and long hours of patient conversation. But he also began introducing her to skills and activities that nurtured independence. She learned to tend to the small garden, to paint delicate pictures, to read and write with increasing confidence. Each success, each small accomplishment, added another brick to the foundation of her identity. Yet transformation was not only external. The man observed subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way she would meet his gaze without fear, the way she began speaking her thoughts without hesitation, the way she initiated laughter instead of responding hesitantly. He saw the emergence of Alara as a complete person, not defined by the chains she had once worn, not defined by the cruelty she had endured, but defined by her own choices, curiosity, and courage. One afternoon, she wandered to the far edge of the estate, the garden stretching into the hills beyond. She paused at a small stream, crouching to touch the clear water. The man approached silently, watching her reflection merge with the ripples. "You're growing strong," he said softly. "I see it in everything you do." Alara looked up at him, her eyes no longer haunted but bright with understanding. "I feel like I'm not just surviving anymore," she admitted quietly. "I'm living." The man's chest tightened. These words, simple as they were, confirmed the profound change that had taken place. She was reclaiming her body, her mind, and her spirit, and he had been privileged to witness it. Their bond matured alongside her transformation. It was no longer just trust. It was affection, reliance, and mutual respect. He became a constant anchor, steady and protective, while she began to contribute to their shared world through conversation, laughter, and even small acts of care for the household animals and garden. In their shared moments, there was no fear, no chains, only connection. Nightfall often found them sitting together by the fire. Alara would share thoughts and dreams, sometimes timidly, sometimes with bold excitement, and he would listen, guiding when needed but never commanding. The house, once a place of loneliness and isolation, now felt alive with warmth, love, and purpose. She had discovered her place, and he had discovered the healing power of giving someone a second chance. By the end of the week, it was clear. Alara was no longer the girl who had arrived in chains, terrified and broken. She was a young girl fully reclaiming her identity, her strength, and her hope. The man, once defined by solitude and grief, found himself equally transformed. In saving her, he had restored a part of himself he thought forever lost. Their lives intertwined seamlessly, each feeding the other's healing. In Alara's laughter, he found joy. In her curiosity, he found purpose. In her freedom, he found redemption. And together, they stepped toward a future unburdened by fear, ready to embrace the life that had long been denied to her, yet now was theirs to shape together. The morning sun spilled across the estate in golden streaks, illuminating the paths Alara had learned to walk without hesitation. She moved with confidence now, her steps no longer tentative, her gaze no longer flinching at every shadow. The chains of her past, both literal and figurative, were gone, replaced by the quiet strength of a girl who had reclaimed her life. Every movement, every glance, radiated the dignity and resilience she had cultivated through weeks of care, patience, and love. The man watched from the doorway, a mixture of awe and quiet pride in his chest. The girl who had once arrived fragile, huddled in tattered rags, had grown into someone vibrant, strong, and fully alive. She was still small, still tender, but there was now a sparkle in her eyes, a sense of agency that declared, "I am here. I belong. I exist." That day, he took her by the hand and led her to the garden, the one place she had come to cherish, where the sun warmed the earth and birds flitted freely through the branches. "Alara," he said softly, "look at what you've become. You've faced your fears, embraced this life, and now it's yours to live. All of it. Every moment." She looked around, taking in the flowers she had planted, the paths she had helped carve, the animals she had cared for. A gentle smile spread across her face, one of pure recognition and ownership. "It feels mine," she whispered. "All of this. It feels like it's really mine." The man knelt to her level, his voice quiet but steady. "It is, and it will remain so. You've earned it, Alara, not through chains or suffering, but through courage, trust, and the strength to grow." She reached for his hand, holding it firmly, her fingers small but resolute. There was no fear in that gesture, only connection, respect, and a bond that had deepened beyond words. He guided her through the estate room by room, revisiting the spaces where her transformation had taken place. The room where she had bathed for the first time, the chair by the fireplace where she had first spoken, the desk where she had learned to write her own name. Each place told a story of survival, of patience, of growth. She ran her fingers along the surfaces, touching memories, acknowledging how far she had come. As the day faded into evening, the man and Alara sat on a hill overlooking the estate. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold, and a gentle wind carried the scent of pine and earth. For the first time, there was no fear, no chains, no shadows of a past that had haunted her. The girl in chains was gone, replaced by Alara, a name, a life, a person fully realized. "Daddy," she said softly, leaning into his side, "thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of gratitude, of trust, and of recognition for the life she had been given and nurtured to embrace. He placed his hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. No, Alara, thank you. You've taught me too about hope, about trust, about the power of giving someone a second chance. You've given me a gift I didn't know I needed. In that moment, they were not merely protector and protected, teacher and pupil, or man and child. They were two souls bound by the transformative power of compassion and resilience. Together, they had healed old wounds, conquered fear, and nurtured life from the ashes of trauma. As night fell, the estate settled into a serene quiet. Alara, once lost, now walked confidently into her second life, a life defined not by suffering, but by choice, freedom, and identity. She had been given a name, a dress, a safe place, and above all, love, and she had claimed all of it. The man watched her silhouette against the fading light, a mixture of pride, relief, and wonder in his heart. In saving her, he had discovered a purpose he had long forgotten. In witnessing her rise, he had learned that the human spirit, even when broken, could be restored with care, patience, and unwavering devotion. Alara was no longer a girl in chains. She was a girl reborn a second life, fully her own, shining brightly in the warmth of a world she had finally learned to trust. And in that world, both she and the man had found something priceless: hope, love, and a future together.